December 17th, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. Snow whipped across the Ardennes forest, carried by a biting wind that sliced through the gaps in torn Wehrmacht greatcoats. The low growl of distant artillery rumbled over the hills, muffled but constant, like thunder that never ended. Obergefreiter Karl Meisner tightened the frayed scarf around his neck as he crouched beside a broken Opel Blitz truck half buried in the snow. The vehicle's radiator hissed steam, its engine long dead. The last of his unit's supply convoy had stalled out before dawn, leaving them stranded on the edge of a frozen road. Around him, 4 mechanics from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division worked in grim silence, their tools clinking faintly in the cold. "Another one gone," muttered Feldwebel Dietrich, the oldest of them, wiping grease from his blackened hands. "We'll never get this heap moving again. Bearings are shot. No spares, no oil, nothing." Karl leaned back against the wheel well, staring out toward the tree line. Beyond the mist, he could hear the rhythmic drone of engines, deep, confident, and relentless. Not the sputtering cough of their blitz trucks, but something far stronger. Moments later, the sound emerged over the rise, a long column of olive-drab vehicles rolling in perfect formation along a parallel forest track. Even through the snow, their markings were clear, white stars on canvas, steel and fuel drums. "Americana!" Dietrich spat, though there was no hatred in his tone, just resignation. The lead vehicle was like nothing Karl had ever seen up close. It wasn't a tank, nor a half-track. It was a truck, massive, purposeful, and moving with the calm rhythm of a machine that never failed. Its broad fenders were caked with mud, its headlights half covered with blackout shields, and yet it ploughed through the snow like it was nothing. "GMC," whispered one of the mechanics, reading the letters stenciled across the hood as the convoy rumbled by. "The Americans call it the Deuce and a Half, 2.5 tons capacity." Karl said nothing. He just watched, truck after truck, stretching as far as the eye could see, each loaded with crates, drums, fuel, ammunition, and food. The lifeblood of an army on the move. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all in motion, all perfectly maintained. And that sound, that deep, unbroken chorus of engines, it was the sound of something more powerful than any tank or gun. It was the sound of an army that could move wherever it wished, whenever it wished. Dietrich kicked at the snow, shaking his head. "You see that, Meisner? That's why we'll lose this war. They build 100 of those while we struggle to fix one." Karl didn't answer. He was still staring at the convoy as it disappeared into the mist, the dark shapes fading like ghosts, leaving behind the faint smell of gasoline and hot oil. The broken blitz beside him groaned as another mechanic slammed its hood shut in frustration. But for Karl, that sound, that stubborn, tired groan, that no longer meant the same thing, because in that frozen moment he understood something he'd never dared to say aloud. The war wasn't being lost on the battlefield. It was being lost on the assembly line, and the Americans. They had turned their factories into weapons. Karl rose slowly, brushing frost from his uniform, his eyes lingering on the trail the convoy had left behind. 2 perfect lines carved into the snow, stretching eastward toward the front. "They'll roll all the way to Berlin," he murmured. Dietrich sighed, his breath a pale cloud in the air. "And there's nothing we can do to stop them." 2 days later, the same sound returned, but this time it came closer. A light snow drifted over the ruined outskirts of a Belgian village. As Karl and his team trudged toward the square, the battlefront had shifted overnight, leaving behind a strange silence. Burned-out German half-tracks and abandoned Allied jeeps littered the road. Among the wreckage sat a large olive-green truck, its rear canvas torn by shrapnel, its tires half sunk into the slush. Dietrich froze, his breath catching. "That's one of them. The GMC." Cautiously the men approached. The cab door hung open, riddled with bullet holes. Inside, the smell of gasoline and scorched rubber mingled with the faint trace of American cigarettes. The driver's seat was empty. The truck had been hastily abandoned, probably during a retreat or artillery barrage. Karl brushed the snow from the hood, tracing his gloved fingers over the stenciled letters. GMCCCKW 353. He pulled himself into the cab and turned the key out of habit. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. The other mechanics stared, stunned. The thing ran. After days of mud, ice, and shrapnel, it started like it had just left the factory floor. The idle was smooth, steady, and confident. Dietrich leaned in beside him, shouting over the engine, "Look at the controls, go. Everything labelled, everything standardised. Every screw is the same size, damn it, even the bolts match." Karl revved the engine gently. The gauges all worked. Oil pressure, temperature, and fuel all stable. It was a miracle compared to the temperamental German machines they were used to coaxing back to life with wire and prayer. "Fuel tank! 300 litres, murmured one of the younger mechanics, reading from a small plate behind the seat. Hydraulic brakes. Reinforced suspension. This thing could carry 3 Blitz trucks worth of supplies. They climbed into the cargo bed. Inside were neatly stacked crates of canned rations, fuel drums, and even a few spare parts, all marked with identical labels and numbers. Precision, order, abundance. Everything the German war machine once prided itself on, but could no longer afford. Carl felt an ache in his chest as he examined the contents. Every item fit perfectly into its place, every box the same size, efficiency multiplied by millions. He looked back toward the road where their last Blitz had broken down. Its hood was still open, its radiator frozen solid. It looked fragile now, almost pitiful beside this towering American workhorse. Dietrich climbed down, shaking his head in disbelief. It's not just the truck, Meissner. It's what it means. Carl understood. The Americans had solved something the Germans never had. The mechanics of war were not just about engines, they were about systems, about replacement and repetition, and about simplicity scaled to infinity. Every nut, every bolt, every soldier, interchangeable, replaceable, ready. He turned off the ignition, the truck's deep rumble fading into the winter air. For a moment no one spoke. The silence that followed was heavier than any artillery barrage. Then one of the younger men broke it quietly. If they have thousands more like this, Dietrich didn't let him finish. They do. Tens of thousands. Carl climbed down, staring at the olive-drab machine as if it was something from another world. And perhaps, in that moment it was, a machine not built for one battle, but for endless war. By late December, the fighting had rolled eastward, and the captured GMC was dragged along with it, its presence both a trophy and a silent reminder of what the German army had lost long before the Ardennes offensive began. Carl and his fellow mechanics worked under a collapsed barn roof sheltered from the falling snow. They had converted the American truck into a makeshift supply hauler for their retreating unit. Even battered and riddled with bullet scars, it performed flawlessly. Every time the ignition was turned, the engine purred to life with unshakable confidence. Still running, Dietrich muttered, kicking snow from his boots. We've rebuilt half our division's vehicles this week, and this one hasn't needed so much as a wrench. Carl was crouched beside the front wheel, checking the suspension. He ran his hand along the leaf springs, still solid despite the weight of heavy cargo. He'd spent months trying to keep German trucks alive on the Eastern Front, scavenging parts from burned-out wrecks, stripping bolts, and fabricating gaskets out of leather. Every kilometre felt like a small miracle. But this machine, it just worked. He looked up at the broad hood, still gleaming beneath its coat of frost. They built this for war the way we build for craftsmanship, he said quietly. We make every part unique, perfect and beautiful. They make millions, and every one of them just works. Dietrich chuckled dryly. The Americans don't fight with soldiers anymore, Meissner. They fight with factories. Carl didn't respond immediately. He was thinking of the long columns of GMCs he'd seen earlier. Convoys stretching beyond the horizon, each one carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and warm clothes. Logistics, he realized, wasn't just about movement, it was about certainty. The Americans could afford to lose a truck, a plane, or even a division, and replace it all by next week. Germany, by contrast, had long since exhausted that luxury. Their supply trains were bombed, their factories shredded by Allied air raids. Replacement parts took months, if they came at all. Even the mighty Tiger tanks, admired and feared by all, often stood idle for lack of spare treads or fuel. Carl's thoughts were interrupted by a distant hum, faint but growing. Engines again. He stepped outside the barn and shaded his eyes against the snowfall. Across the valley, a new Allied convoy was advancing. Rows of trucks just like theirs, headlights dim under blackout covers, each keeping perfect distance from the next. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. He felt it again, that hollow pressure in his chest. Awe, envy and despair all twisted together. Dietrich joined him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. You know, he said quietly, I used to think the Americans didn't understand war. All that luxury, all that excess. But this is war. Not the fighting, the feeding, the fueling, the moving. Carl nodded slowly. And we can't match it. No, Dietrich said, exhaling a thin plume of smoke. We never could. We were building dreams while they were building engines. The two men stood in silence as the sound of the Allied trucks rolled across the valley. A low, unbroken chorus of mechanical precision. It was the sound of inevitability, of a machine that could not be stopped by bravery or strategy or pride. When the last truck disappeared into the snow, Carl turned back to their own captured GMC. It idled steadily, exhaust rising like steam from a locomotive, and in that moment he knew The war was no longer about who had the best soldiers or the fiercest weapons. It was about who could move, who could sustain, and the Americans could move forever. January 2nd, 1945, somewhere near Prüm, Germany. The snow had deepened overnight, muffling the rumble of distant artillery and burying the last remnants of the Ardennes offensive beneath a heavy white shroud. Karl Meisner sat inside the cab of the captured GMC truck, his breath fogging the windshield. The vehicle had become both refuge and revelation, a small pocket of warmth in a collapsing war. Outside, the rest of the mechanics worked silently, salvaging what they could from the remains of their retreat: broken half-tracks, burned motorcycles, twisted axles, each one a small monument to Germany's crumbling logistics. The truck beside them, the American truck, still stood tall, idling like it was built for eternity. Dietrich climbed into the passenger seat, stamping snow from his boots. His face was drawn, his eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. "We just got orders," he said. "They're pulling us east to the Rhine. Everything west of here will be abandoned." Karl didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the dashboard, on the flawless dials, the sturdy controls, and the precision of every moving part. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a statement, a physical embodiment of an empire that could build faster than anyone could destroy. "Dietrich," he said slowly, "you've seen the Luftwaffe bases, haven't you? The ones they bombed out?" "Dozens," Dietrich replied. "What of them?" Karl turned toward him. "They're still running air raids, even now. Hundreds of planes, every night. Do you ever wonder how they keep them fueled, supplied, repaired?" Dietrich sighed, rubbing his temple. "Trucks like this," he muttered. "Tens of thousands of them." Karl nodded. "They say one American division has more transport vehicles than our entire army group, and they can replace every one within a week." He looked down at his gloved hands, oil-stained and trembling. "We're fighting ghosts, Dietrich, ghosts made of steel and gasoline." Outside, the wind howled through the forest. A lone soldier passed by, dragging a sled piled with munitions, a grim contrast to the endless Allied convoys that moved by motor and road. Every German soldier Karl saw these days seemed to be pulling something, carrying something, dragging the war on their backs. Meanwhile, the Americans, the British, and even the Canadians rode the war forward. He pressed a palm to the steering wheel, feeling the faint vibration of the engine beneath his hand. There was a calmness to it, a quiet rhythm that didn't belong on this battlefield. It spoke of order, of abundance, of certainty. Dietrich exhaled slowly, his breath clouding the air. "You know what's funny, Meissner? We were supposed to be the engineers of Europe, the best craftsmen in the world. And now look at us, stealing trucks just to survive." Karl cracked a faint, humorless smile. "Maybe that's our problem. We built for perfection. They built for persistence." Dietrich leaned back against the seat, staring through the frosted windshield. "And persistence wins wars." Outside, a distant boom echoed. Another bridge blown behind the retreating lines. The road to the Rhine was being sealed off. Soon they would be cut off entirely. Karl reached over and turned off the ignition. The engine gave a final, dignified rumble before settling into silence. The sudden quiet was almost unbearable. He looked at the truck one last time, at its perfect gauges, its sturdy frame, and its promise of endurance. And then he whispered, almost to himself, "When German mechanics saw these, they didn't just see a truck, they saw the future. And they knew we weren't part of it." Dietrich said nothing. He didn't have to. Both men understood. In that snowbound ruin of a war that once promised glory, two weary mechanics had finally seen what their generals never would, that the might of an army no longer lived in its tanks or guns, but in its trucks, and that realization was heavier than defeat itself.